It began on an ordinary night in Noida, one that would soon become one of the most haunting and polarizing crime stories in modern India, a case where truth, suspicion, and sorrow became indistinguishable. The date was May 15, 2008. The place, Flat L32, Jalvayu Vihar, a quiet residential colony meant for Air Force officers and their families. Inside lived the Talwars, Dr. Rajesh Talwar, a respected dentist, his wife Dr. Nupur Talwar, and their 14-year-old daughter Aarushi. To the world, they were the image of urban success. Intelligent, well-mannered, close-knit. But before dawn broke the next morning, that image would be shattered forever. The evening of May 15th was ordinary, even pleasant. Aarushi, bright and spirited, was celebrating an early birthday. Her 15th was just days away. Her parents gave her a digital camera as a gift. She smiled, clicked a few pictures, and shared a light dinner with them. Also in the house that night was Hemraj Banjade, the family's live-in domestic helper, a 45-year-old man from Nepal, who had been with the Talwars for years. He served them dinner, locked the main gate from the inside, and retired to his small room on the terrace. Nothing, not a single sound, disturbed the night air of Noida's quiet Sector 25. At least, not until morning. At 6 a.m., Nupur knocked on Arushi's bedroom door to wake her for school. It was locked from the inside. They assumed she was asleep, but when repeated knocks went unanswered, Rajesh fetched the keys and opened the door. The sight that greeted them froze time itself. Aarushi lay motionless on her bed, covered in her blanket. Her throat had been slit with surgical precision, a clean, deep cut. There were injuries on her forehead, blunt and forceful. Her room, otherwise neat, had signs of disturbance. The whiskey bottle on the table, the camera gone. Their only servant, Hemraj, was missing, and immediately the Talwars, in shock and grief, assumed he was the killer. Within hours, neighbors and police filled the apartment. Reporters swarmed the gates. Arushi's face, gentle, innocent, appeared on every television screen in India. The Noida police, ill-equipped and unprepared for the media storm, announced their theory with startling haste. The servant, Hemraj, is absconding. He is the prime suspect. For the rest of that day, the case was simple: a domestic crime, a brutal betrayal, an open and shut investigation, until the next morning, when the real horror was discovered. On May 17th, police finally went upstairs to the terrace, where the door had been locked. When they broke it open, the unbearable stench of decomposition hit them. There, under a cooler and a blood-stained bedsheet, lay the body of Hemraj. His throat had been slit the same way. The weapon, sharp, deliberate, clean. The killer had been in the house both nights. The case was no longer simple. 2 murders, no forced entry, no robbery, and no clear suspect. Forensic experts arrived late. Evidence was already contaminated. Strangers had walked through the house. Journalists had touched the crime scene, and the terrace had been exposed to sunlight. Vital clues, fingerprints, blood samples, possible DNA traces, were lost. Yet amid the chaos, one thing stood out. Both killings bore professional precision, almost surgical, the kind of skill that required anatomical knowledge. That single observation would change everything. Within days, suspicion began to shift, away from servants and outsiders, toward the very people inside the house. By the end of May, whispers began to spread. Was this a case of honor, hidden behind suburban respectability? Had the parents, both doctors, discovered something that night they couldn't bear to see? Or had someone else, someone close, entered quietly and vanished without a trace? Theories divided the nation. Half believed the Talwars were victims, grieving parents vilified by a failed investigation. The other half believed they were hiding the darkest truth of all. In truth, the story of Aarushi Talwar's death wasn't just a crime. It became a mirror. It reflected the cracks in India's justice system, the hunger of the media, and the dangers of certainty in a world built on speculation. And as police stumbled through one mistake after another, they missed something crucial. A small, overlooked clue that would later become the key to understanding what might have really happened that night. But by then, it would already be too late. When the second body was found, the air around flat L32 seemed to thicken, not just with the scent of death, but with something invisible, heavier: suspicion, mistrust. The story that had begun as a tragic murder of a child had become a labyrinth where every door led to a deeper question. By the time the police realized that Hemraj's body had been lying on the terrace all along, the media frenzy was uncontrollable. Reporters camped outside the Talwar residence, their cameras fixed on the building's pale facade like vultures watching a carcass. Everyone wanted an answer, and quickly. Inside, the Talwars were inconsolable. Rajesh sat silent, staring into nothing. Nupur was unable to comprehend how their daughter's bedroom had become a crime scene. The irony was unbearable. Two doctors, people of science trained to heal and preserve life, now surrounded by blood and death. But grief wasn't enough for the world outside. The crowd wanted a culprit. On May 23, 2008, just 8 days after the murders, the Noida police made a shocking announcement. They claimed the case was solved. Their theory? A tale of rage, jealousy, and illicit relationships. The kind that sells newspapers and keeps the public glued to television screens. According to the police, Rajesh Talwar had discovered Aarushi and Hemraj in an objectionable situation. In a fit of rage, they claimed, he had killed both, using a surgical instrument to slit their throats with clinical precision. It was a story that sounded dramatic enough to be true, but it wasn't built on evidence. There were no fingerprints, no weapon, no witnesses, only assumptions, coincidences, and pressure to deliver a headline. The media seized it like wildfire. News anchors debated morality and honor killings. Pundits spoke of modern parenting and Western corruption. Neighbors who had once smiled politely now whispered behind closed doors, and the Talwars, already broken by loss, suddenly became the villains of their own tragedy. Their grief was reinterpreted as guilt. Their silence was painted as arrogance. Even their professions became suspicious. Two dentists who knew how to cut a throat cleanly. The public, fueled by rumor, demanded punishment before truth. Meanwhile, something stranger was happening inside the investigation itself. The police officers handling the case contradicted each other's statements. Evidence was misplaced. The forensic samples, blood, fingerprints, vaginal swabs, were mixed up, mislabeled, and some even destroyed. One officer admitted that he had not sealed the crime scene for more than 24 hours after the murder. Another had allowed journalists to walk through Aarushi's room before the forensic team arrived. One constable, reportedly, ate food from the Talwar's kitchen while the investigation was ongoing. It was chaos disguised as procedure. But beneath the noise, something darker began to surface. The wounds on both victims were nearly identical. Deep cuts on the throat, almost ritualistic in precision. Yet the angle of the blows suggested two different weapons. Aarushi's injuries were more delicate, Hemraj's more violent. It was as if two separate emotions had guided the killer's hands. One cold, one furious. Moreover, the blood patterns didn't make sense. There were no signs of forced entry and no robbery. Whoever committed these murders knew the layout of the house and was comfortable moving through it in the dark. This wasn't the work of an outsider. It was someone who belonged there, someone trusted. Weeks later, the Central Bureau of Investigation, CBI, was brought in to clean the mess left behind by the Noida police. Two senior officers, experienced, composed, entered the case with the promise of professionalism and truth. But what they found was a battlefield of contradictions. The Talwars cooperated fully, gave their blood samples, submitted to lie detector tests, even surrendered their dental instruments. But instead of clearing them, the investigation seemed to loop endlessly between two realities. One where they were innocent victims, another where they were the only possible culprits. Meanwhile, public perception had already sealed their fate. A middle-class family caught between the power of gossip and the incompetence of authority. And yet, among the wreckage of rumor, one forgotten clue began to stand out. Something most investigators had dismissed in the early hours of the case. It wasn't found in the blood or on the walls. It wasn't part of the bodies or the terrace. It was something far simpler: a missing phone. Aarushi's mobile, switched off after midnight, had vanished completely. Someone had taken it and used it briefly in the days after her death. Whoever held that phone may have known the truth, but by the time investigators traced it, the signal had disappeared into the void. The case that began as a murder had now become a riddle, one that challenged logic, blurred morality, and left behind more ghosts than answers. But what the CBI would discover next would divide the nation forever. Because in the basement archives of the investigation, two conflicting case files were about to be born, both written by men who claimed to serve the truth. And yet each told an entirely different story. When the Central Bureau of Investigation officially took over the Aarushi Hemraj double murder case in June 2008, it was meant to bring order to chaos, science to speculation, logic to hysteria. But instead, it became a duel of narratives, two teams, two interpretations, and two versions of the truth that could never coexist. The first CBI team, led by Joint Director Arun Kumar, approached the case with methodical precision. They re-examined every photograph, every forensic sample, and every witness statement. The picture that began to emerge wasn't one of rage or family betrayal, but of an external intrusion. Arun Kumar's theory was bold. The murders weren't committed by the Talwars. They were the victims of a larger conspiracy of negligence and cover-up, one that began inside the house but didn't end there. His team focused on three men: the Talwars' household helpers and their acquaintances, Krishna, a dental assistant working at Rajesh Talwar's clinic, Rajkumar, a servant from a neighboring family, and Vijay Mandal, a driver from the same residential colony. All three were close to the family, familiar with the home, and known to Hemraj. Each had been in or around the Talwar residence on the days leading up to the murders, and as interrogations unfolded, strange inconsistencies began to appear. Under narco-analysis tests, Krishna allegedly mentioned a scuffle with Dr. Rajesh Talwar days before the murder, a moment of humiliation that had left him angry. He also referenced a night of drinking and visiting Hemraj's room. But the details were incoherent, dreamlike, unreliable. Still, the CBI found traces of blood on Krishna's kukri, a Nepali-style knife, and mattresses seized from his quarters showed stains that could not be conclusively matched. It wasn't proof, but it was something. The first CBI team was convinced. This was not a family crime. It was a break-in gone wrong, perhaps triggered by drunken rage or sexual intent. But before they could act, the tide turned. In late 2009, a new team took over, led by Superintendent A.G.L. Kaul. And with that transfer, the entire narrative flipped. Every assumption, every inference made by the previous investigators was systematically dismantled. Kaul's team argued that the intruder theory was implausible. There were no signs of forced entry, no missing valuables, and the lock system of the flat could not be manipulated from outside. Moreover, the terrace door, where Hemraj's body was found, could be locked only from the inside of the house. So if no outsider could have entered or left unnoticed, then the only possibility left was inside. The second CBI team refocused on the Talwars themselves. Their argument was chilling in its simplicity. No stranger could have executed two precise murders inside a secure apartment, left no trace, and locked the doors behind them. To them, the Talwars weren't victims. They were participants. They emphasized behavioral evidence. The parents' controlled reactions, Rajesh's calm demeanor, Nupur's lack of visible emotion. Every tear, every gesture was analyzed through a lens of suspicion. Their theory evolved into something disturbingly cinematic. Rajesh Talwar, enraged upon discovering his daughter and Hemraj in an objectionable state, had killed both in a sudden explosion of rage. Nupur either assisted or helped clean up the aftermath. No murder weapon was found. No motive was proven. But the story, polished by repetition and rumor, began to sound like fact. The two CBI teams clashed silently through paperwork. Their files, both labeled top secret, contradicted each other line by line. Team 1, parents innocent, outsider involvement likely. Team 2, parents guilty, crime of passion. What followed was a bureaucratic tragedy. The official truth changed not because of new evidence, but because of new leadership. By the end of 2010, the second CBI report, the one accusing the Talwars, was filed in court. But here was the twist. The CBI itself admitted it had no conclusive proof. The charge sheet stated plainly, there is insufficient evidence to prosecute the accused. And yet, in an almost surreal turn of events, the court rejected that statement and decided to try the Talwars anyway. It was an act of judicial paradox, a trial without proof, a prosecution without motive, a story that had replaced truth itself. The courtroom became a theater, the public became the jury, and two grieving parents already destroyed by loss found themselves fighting not just for justice, but for their very identity. Outside, the world moved on. Inside, the walls of flat L32 stood cold, locked, and silent. The rooms where laughter once echoed now belonged to no one. But beneath that silence, one unanswered question lingered, one that neither CBI team had ever solved. Why had Aarushi's bedroom door been locked from the inside, but found slightly ajar the next morning? That single contradiction, like a whisper trapped in the walls, would haunt every version of this story that followed. By 2011, the story of Aarushi and Hemraj had stopped being just a tragedy. It had become a national obsession, a slow-burning storm of speculation, televised debate, and whispered judgments. Every headline was a verdict. Every silence was treated as guilt. And in the middle of it all stood two parents, Dr. Rajesh and Dr. Nupur Talwar, accused of murdering their own daughter. The courtroom in Ghaziabad, where the trial was to be held, didn't look like a place where justice for such a complicated case could ever unfold. It was a modest room lined with dusty files, overworked staff, and flickering ceiling fans that seemed to echo the weariness of the system itself. Yet within those walls, the most sensational murder trial of modern India was about to begin. The CBI, now led by Officer A.G.L. Kaul, presented their case with quiet determination. They had no direct evidence, no fingerprints, no weapon, no blood-stained clothes, no confession. What they had were inferences, patterns, behavior, possibilities dressed as proof. And so the trial became less about what happened and more about what could have happened. The CBI's theory painted a night of horror within the calm of a middle-class home. According to them, on the night of May 15, 2008, Dr. Rajesh Talwar found his daughter Aarushi in an objectionable position with Hemraj. In a fit of uncontrollable rage, he struck Hemraj with a golf club, killing him instantly. Panicking at what Aarushi had witnessed, he turned the weapon on her. Nupur allegedly helped clean the scene, lock the terrace, and fabricate a story to hide their guilt. It was, in truth, a story more than an investigation, a narrative that filled the gaps where evidence did not exist. And it was one that the media, hungry for scandal, embraced wholeheartedly. The Talwars, once respected dentists, were now villains on primetime television, Every news anchor became a prosecutor, every viewer a self-appointed judge. Inside the courtroom, however, reality was far less dramatic. Witness after witness failed to establish anything concrete. Key forensic evidence had been destroyed, mishandled, or simply lost. The first crime scene investigators admitted under oath that they hadn't sealed off the apartment properly. Curious onlookers had walked through Aarushi's room. Police officers had smoked on the terrace where Hemraj's blood still pooled. The pillowcase that was supposed to carry Hemraj's DNA turned out, after retesting, to belong to someone completely unrelated. Everything, from blood samples to fingerprints, had been contaminated beyond repair. Yet despite this collapse of physical evidence, the case continued. The prosecution's strength was never its proof. It was its persistence. And slowly, the narrative began to outweigh the facts. Photographs of a smiling Aarushi were shown in court. The prosecution described her as too modern, too independent, too secretive. Words like character and honor began creeping into the testimony. Words that had no place in evidence, but every place in prejudice. It was as if the courtroom had slipped backward in time, into an era where morality was judged more harshly than murder itself. Meanwhile, the Talwars sat through each session in quiet agony. They weren't just fighting for acquittal, they were fighting for memory. For their daughter's name, which had been twisted into something scandalous, for their own faces, which the nation had learned to see only through suspicion. Friends distanced themselves, patients stopped visiting their clinic. Their once normal lives had become a waking nightmare, unfolding under fluorescent lights and endless questioning. Through it all, they refused to confess. They refused to change their story, even when it would have made life easier. "We didn't kill our daughter," Rajesh repeated again and again. "We're living our punishment every single day." By 2013, after 5 years of public scrutiny and institutional failure, the trial neared its end. There was still no conclusive evidence, no eyewitness, no motive beyond speculation, and yet something dark was taking shape. A hunger, not for justice, but for closure. The media had built a story so large that to admit uncertainty now would mean dismantling it entirely. The court's decision would not only determine the fate of the Talwars, it would define how India understood truth in the age of spectacle. When the final arguments concluded, the judge leaned forward and said softly, "Circumstantial evidence can be enough if it forms an unbroken chain leading to guilt. But what if that chain was made of imagination? What if its links were forged from rumor, pressure, and fatigue?" As the judge withdrew to deliberate, a strange silence settled over the courtroom, the kind of silence that comes before something irreversible. The verdict would come soon, and when it did, it would shake the nation. But first, there was one final revelation, a detail buried in the CBI's own files, one that could have changed everything. It had to do with Hemraj's mobile phone, the last trace of his existence, a device that disappeared from the scene only to reappear hundreds of miles away, switched on days later. Who had it? And why had no one ever traced that signal properly? That small blinking icon on a distant cell tower might have held the truth. But by then, the machinery of justice was already moving. It was November 25th, 2013, 5 years after that quiet night in Noida when the lights went out in the Talwar household. Outside the Ghaziabad District Court, a sea of cameras blinked like restless eyes waiting for the story's end. Reporters jostled, microphones thrust forward, every breath heavy with anticipation. Inside, the air was different, still, tense, expectant. The Talwars sat side by side, hands clasped, their faces pale with the weight of years. And then the gavel fell. The accused, Dr. Rajesh Talwar and Dr. Nupur Talwar, are found guilty of murder and destruction of evidence. The words hit like a physical blow. A ripple ran through the courtroom. Gasps, whispers, a low murmur of disbelief. Nupur covered her face with trembling hands. Rajesh sat frozen, staring into some invisible distance, as if trying to understand how the truth could bend so far. Outside, the headlines were already forming. Parents convicted in daughter's murder. Justice for Aarushi. The media that had once built the story now crowned itself the judge. The verdict was based entirely on circumstantial evidence, a chain of assumptions so fragile that even one missing link would collapse it. But in this case, the chain wasn't about proof, it was about belief. The court argued that the Talwars' behavior was unnatural, that their calmness, their insistence on privacy, their refusal to cry before cameras were signs of guilt, as if grief had only one acceptable shape. The absence of evidence became the proof itself. It was the perfect paradox. Because there was nothing, they must have hidden everything. The Talwars were sentenced to life imprisonment and taken to Dasna jail. From doctors to convicts, from respected citizens to symbols of parental betrayal, their descent had been complete. In the first letters they wrote from prison, they didn't talk about pain or fear. They talked about Aarushi. She would have wanted us to keep fighting, Nupur wrote. If we stop now, it will be as if we accepted their story over ours. Inside their small prison cell, they set up a makeshift dental clinic. They treated other inmates, offered free checkups, and kept busy in silence. They refused to let their lives rot under the weight of accusation. In that place of despair, they still tried to heal. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, the world had moved on. The cameras had turned to newer scandals, newer tragedies. The names Aarushi and Hemraj now appeared only in brief mentions, cold lines in old case files. But beneath the silence, something continued to stir. A new team within the CBII began quietly revisiting the inconsistencies. They reviewed the crime scene photos again, the blood spatter patterns, the locked terrace, the mishandled pillowcase, and slowly, the fractures in the narrative saddened. The blood on the stairs didn't match the supposed sequence of events. The golf club, the alleged murder weapon, had no trace of human blood. Even the timeline of Arushi's death didn't fit neatly with the prosecution's story. And then there was Hemraj's phone. That single device had pinged cell towers near Nepal days after the murders. Someone had used his SIM card. Someone had answered calls, yet this trail had been ignored, written off as irrelevant during the original investigation. Who carried that phone across borders? Who had access to it after Hemraj's death? The more the files were studied, the clearer it became. The pieces of this puzzle were never meant to fit. They had been forced to. By 2015, a quiet shift began within the public. Journalists, once loud in accusation, began to question the cracks they'd ignored. Documentaries, independent reports, and podcasts started re-examining what really happened that night in Noida, Sector 25. And what they found was not closure, but chaos. The court's version of the truth no longer stood alone. It wobbled under the weight of contradictions, of evidence lost and logic twisted. In 2017, after 4 years in prison, the Allahabad High Court finally delivered its judgment on the Talwars' appeal. The courtroom was hushed when the words came. The conviction cannot be sustained. There is no evidence that conclusively proves their guilt. In that instant, freedom returned, but not peace. The Talwars were acquitted, but the questions that haunted them had no answers. If not them, then who? They walked out of Dasna jail into a world that had already judged them years ago. Their home was gone, their clinic shut down. The neighbors avoided their gaze. They were free, but they had nowhere to go. And most painfully of all, Aarushi was still gone. Her memory, once bright and innocent, had been dragged through the mud of speculation until it was unrecognizable. The parents had fought not only for their innocence, but for her dignity, a fight that had cost them everything. Even now, the case remains unsolved. 2 lives lost, reputations destroyed, and a nation still unsure what truth looks like when everyone wants a story instead. The Talwars live quietly today, away from cameras and judgment. Their voices are soft, measured, carrying years of exhaustion, but not bitterness. "We never wanted sympathy," Rajesh once said. "We only wanted truth." But the truth, like the night of the murder itself, remains veiled, shrouded by confusion, noise, and the imperfections of those who sought it. Some stories do not end with clarity, they end with silence, and perhaps in that silence lies the only honesty left.